Hollywood loves to show us the Middle Ages as a time of knights in shining armor. You see them proud, noble, defending the weak, with banners waving against the backdrop of majestic castles. This image, steeped in romance and honor, is deeply ingrained in our minds. We hear the fanfare, feel the grandeur of their feats, and believe in their unwavering valor. But this is a dangerous lie. That image shatters in an instant, giving way to an entirely different scene. You stand in the smoke of a burning village, the acrid smell of burning stings your nostrils, and the screams and cries of children pierce the air. Before you are not noble heroes, but horsemen whose armor is covered not in glory, but in dirt and blood, and in their hands are not swords of honor, but torches of destruction. Because the truth is far grimmer than any Hollywood fairy tale. In medieval Europe, the line between a noble feudal lord and an outright bandit was razor thin. Castles were often not bastions of justice, but nests of predators, and knightly forces were not liberators, but waves of systematic destruction. We're used to thinking that bandits are always rootless outcasts hiding in the forests, but what if I told you that the most fearsome predators sat in castles, held titles, and called themselves noble? What if entire regions were devastated not by wild hordes, but by perfectly legitimate armies, employing tactics that today would be called a war crime? We're talking about the robber barons, or Raubritter, and about the tactic of Chevauchée, systematic raids that turned entire provinces into scorched earth. Brace yourselves, because what you're about to learn will forever change your understanding of medieval nobility and who truly was the most fearsome predator on the roads and in the villages of medieval Europe. Myth: bandits are always low-born criminals hiding in the forests. The reality, however, is far more cynical. Many bandits were feudal lords, knights, or noblemen who used their castles for extortion, robbery, and kidnappings, justifying this as legitimate feuds or financial disputes. We're used to thinking of castles as symbols of protection and order, as strongholds where valiant knights protect their lands. But what if the walls meant to protect were actually prison walls for everyone who dared to pass by? You are a merchant sailing down the Rhine. The sun glints on the waves, promising a smooth passage, but ahead, perched on a cliff, a gloomy castle looms. Its silhouette doesn't inspire confidence. Instead, it feels like a heavy weight on your chest. You see iron chains stretched across the river, blocking your path, and hear the harsh shouts of guards demanding an exorbitant toll. Your heart clenches with despair. This isn't a legitimate collection, it's outright robbery. Your goods, your profits, and sometimes even your very life, all are in the hands of these noble bandits whose armor gleams in the sun, but whose intentions are as dark as their fortress's dungeon. You understand that resistance is futile. You are a prisoner here, and the castle on the rock isn't a defense, but a noose around your neck. This was the jarring reality experienced by everyone who encountered the so-called Raubritter, robber barons. Now, for a dispassionate analysis, the reason such blatant plunder flourished was the weakness of central authority, especially pronounced during the Great Interregnum in the Holy Roman Empire. Without a strong emperor, every petty feudal lord felt like a king on his own mountain. These so-called noble predators built castles in strategically important locations, such as the steep bends of the Rhine, and strung chains across the river. They exacted unjust tolls from any passing vessel, justifying this with ancient rites or fabricated feuds. The line between legitimate collection and pure extortion blurred beyond recognition, turning trade into a game of Russian roulette, and the knights into the mafiosi of their time. Their methods weren't limited to mere river tolls, kidnappings for ransom, raids on neighboring villages under the pretext of financial disputes or compensation for damages. All of this was part of the daily life of these so-called noble knights. They exploited their status, their castles, and their military might to terrorize the surrounding region, bringing destruction and fear, all while hiding behind the shield of feudal rights. Not everyone who sits in a castle is a protector. Sometimes he is the most dangerous predator, using the law as a shield for his crimes and his title as a license to plunder. This was not merely banditry, it was systemic corruption, embedded in the very fabric of medieval society. But what happened when these noble bandits ventured beyond their castles and began truly preying on people, transforming entire regions into disaster zones where no peasant or town could feel safe? But what happened when these noble brigands ventured beyond their castles and started truly hunting people, turning entire regions into disaster zones where no peasant or town could feel safe? Myth. Medieval warfare was always about armies clashing on open fields, where valiant knights fought for honor and glory. The reality, however, was far more brutal. Often it involved systematic raids known as Chevauchée, aimed at destroying resources and terrorizing the population, carried out by knights and mercenaries rather than direct battles. Forget the romanticized image of two armies lining up on an open field. The true horror of medieval warfare was far more akin to scorched-earth tactics, where the enemy wasn't just defeated, but utterly annihilated. You stand on a hill, and the wind carries to you not only the scent of freshly mown grass, but also a pungent, bitter smoke. In the distance, on the horizon, pillars of black smoke rise, like giant fingers pointing to the sky. Then you hear the increasing rumble of hooves, barely discernible at first, then growing stronger and stronger, like an approaching storm. Mounted troops, like a swarm of locusts, sweep across the fields, leaving nothing but chaos in their wake. They set fire to barns overflowing with crops, drive off livestock, and destroy homes, turning once thriving villages into smoldering ruins. You feel terror gripping you as you realize this isn't merely an army advancing to battle. It's a tide of sheer wanton destruction, designed to break the will to resist, to annihilate the very fabric of life. What you've just pictured is no accident, not merely a byproduct of war. It was a deliberate, brutal, and incredibly effective strategy known as Chevauchée. And now, a sobering analysis of this barbaric tactic. The reason it became such a widespread tool lay in its ability to weaken the enemy without having to engage in costly and risky direct battles. A chevauchée was not merely plunder. It was economic and psychological warfare. The objective was not to seize territory or defeat an army, but rather to destroy agricultural resources, infrastructure, and, most importantly, the morale of the civilian population. By burning fields and homes and driving off livestock, the attackers deprived the enemy of taxes, food, and support, condemning the region to famine and devastation. These raids often employed light cavalry and mercenary free companies, units of battle-hardened veterans for whom war was their only trade. Their mobility made these chevauchés swift, destructive, and extremely difficult for local militias to counter. A prime example is the large-scale campaigns of the Black Prince during the 100 Years' War, which devastated entire regions of France, leaving behind scorched earth and thousands of shattered lives while rarely engaging in major battles. The most destructive military campaigns of the Middle Ages were not about glory and honor, nor about noble struggles for ideals. They were about the systematic destruction of ordinary people's lives, about undermining authority through terror and starvation, and about turning prosperous lands into a barren desert. This was a war where the civilian population became the primary target. And if even entire armies led by noble commanders could descend into marauding and destruction, what then of those who simply worked the roads without allegiance to any flag, yet possessing the same and at times even greater brutality? And if even entire armies led by so-called noble commanders could devolve into marauders and destroyers, what then of those who simply worked the roads with no flag to rally under, yet possessing the same and sometimes even greater cruelty? The myth. Road bandits were simply thieves, easy to spot, whose goal was mere robbery. The reality, however, was far more complex and terrifying. The threat on the roads took many forms, ranging from noble kidnappers to former soldiers, and their methods were extremely brutal, often involving torture, blurring the line between law and crime. Forget the stereotypical fairy tale bandits who simply snatch your wallet. On medieval roads, you weren't just dealing with thieves, but with predators for whom your life and dignity were nothing more than pawns in their ruthless game. You're driving down a forest road, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig feels like a threat, sending your heart racing. The sun filters through the dense canopy, creating ghostly shadows, and suddenly, riders burst out from the bushes. Their faces are obscured by mud or hoods, and their eyes burn with a wild, insatiable greed. You hear the clang of steel, harsh shouts. You smell the acrid scent of sweat and animal fear that instantly paralyzes you. You're seized, thrown to the ground, bound. The nightmare begins. Suffocating smoke from burning herbs fills your lungs, making you choke, and then a tearing pain shoots through your joints as you're suspended by your limbs, a weight stretching your body to its absolute limit. The next moment, a rope is wound around your head, and you feel it slowly, relentlessly tighten, compressing your skull, pressing into your brain, threatening to split it apart. This isn't just a robbery, it's the complete methodical annihilation of human dignity, a reduction to an animal screaming in agony. What you've just experienced isn't fiction, it's the grim reality of medieval roads. Now, let's take a cold, hard look at this. The reason for this brutal cruelty was rooted in the principle of wolf seed, or wolf's head. A person declared an outlaw was stripped of all rights. They were no longer considered human, but were equated to a wild animal that could be killed or tortured without repercussions. This created a monstrous legal loophole justifying any cruelty. The threat on the roads was truly diverse. These could include noble kidnappers, impoverished noblemen, or knights who would take people hostage, demanding ransom from their families or feudal lords. Their methods were sometimes no less sophisticated than those of outright bandits, as their single goal was to break their victim's will and extract money. Operating alongside them were former soldiers and deserters from the free companies, hardened by the Chevauchée, for whom torture and violence were simply part of their profession. Their brutality was indistinguishable from war crimes, yet on civilian roads there was no accountability for such acts. Gruesome descriptions have survived of tortures employed by bandits, methods that are shocking even today, suffocating victims with smoke to force them to reveal hidden valuables, suspending them by their limbs with weights that ripped joints apart, and of course, crushing the head with a rope, which, besides causing excruciating pain, often led to irreversible damage or death. These methods demonstrate a complete lack of moral restraint and a boundless ingenuity in inflicting suffering. On a medieval road, there were no mere bandits, no clear line between good and evil. Any attacker could be anyone, from a ruined nobleman using his status as a cover to a deserter who had forgotten everything but violence. Their goal was not just robbery, but complete subjugation, to demonstrate absolute power over their victim, often through unbearable pain and humiliation. But what happened when the most defenseless fell victim to these noble or military bandits, peasants who were trying to protect their homes and families without weapons or money for ransom, and for whom there was only one most terrifying outcome? But what happened when these noble or military brigands preyed upon the most vulnerable, the peasants, who, with no weapons and no money for ransom, tried to protect their homes and families, and for whom there was only one most dreadful outcome? We began this journey with a romanticized image of the Middle Ages, where noble knights were always heroes, and bandits were simple common criminals, easy to tell apart. We believed in clear boundaries between good and evil, honor and dishonor, protectors and predators. This myth, reinforced by Hollywood, gave us a false sense of order in a chaotic era. But the reality we've just uncovered is far more cynical and brutal. This nobility was often just a mask for extortion, plunder, and systematic terror. The most fearsome predators resided in castles, held titles, and called themselves noble, using law and status as a shield for their crimes. Entire regions were devastated not by wild hordes, but by perfectly legitimate armies during Chevauchée, and highwaymen were a multifaceted threat for whom torture and murder were commonplace. Return to the burning village. You see the peasants who tried to fight back, their bodies lie among the smoldering ruins, their faces contorted in terror, their screams frozen in the smoky air. You smell the acrid scent of burning, you hear the groans of the wounded, dying without aid. But then you see a different picture, the neighboring village that surrendered immediately. The houses are intact. The residents, though robbed of everything they owned, are alive. They lost all their possessions, but they kept the most important thing, their lives. It's a jarring realization that uncovers the most uncomfortable truth. Peasants who attempted to resist in their lightly defended villages often faced far more brutal consequences than those who surrendered immediately. They couldn't be held for ransom because they had no money and no noble relatives. They weren't seen as valuable labor. They were simply killed, without remorse, without any purpose other than to demonstrate absolute power and instill fear. For defenseless villages, resistance was not merely ineffective, it was mortally dangerous. Even the Peace of God movement, the church's attempt to protect non-combatants, only underscores the sheer scale of the violence that civilians faced. This inconvenient truth is crucial, not just for understanding the Middle Ages. It teaches us to look critically at any romanticized version of history, at any glossy portrayal. It teaches that behind glittering facades and noble titles, there always lies hidden a complex, often brutal reality of human nature and power. It compels us to question those myths that distract us from the true essence of things, from the real mechanisms of violence and survival. Now, when you picture a knight in shining armor, you no longer see a fairy tale hero. You see a potential robber baron, whose legitimate taxes are nothing more than highway robbery on the Rhine. You see a participant in a Chevauchée, bringing death and devastation to entire provinces. You see a ruthless torturer, extracting information through torture on a forest road. You see not just a symbol of honor, but a symbol of power that could be both a shield and a weapon of the most sophisticated and brutal violence. And this is the true, unromanticized, yet honest picture of medieval Europe.